1968. American computer scientist and mathematician Donald Knuth publishes a book called The Art of Computer Programming, which the American Scientist magazine includes in the list of 100 or so books that shaped a century of science. This book, among other things, was the first to present the development of software as something that should be written in a structured manner, resulting in readable and understandable code. In the same year, 1968, a publication called Go to Statement Considered Harmful is published. Although it is very specific, it forms a clear idea. Even simple programs must be written with readability in mind to understand what is happening in the program. Already at that time, the idea appears that code is not only about the speed of execution, but also about how maintainable and understandable it is. It becomes obvious that this factor is no less important than the performance of the program, if not more important. A year later, a 17-year-old boy decided to tie his future to the software industry and began his journey.
That boy was Robert Martin, known to many as Uncle Bob, and his work Clean Code is now on everyone's lips. Some hated it, some admire it, and some are looking for its practical applications. That's what we're gonna talk about today. I won't go into the all boring theoretical stuff. I want to talk about Salesforce development and those practices that are not only theoretically useful, but also practically brings a lot of benefits. I'll touch on both Apex and JavaScript code for your LWC component, and we will try to find that line when clean code is clean enough to be readable and maintainable, but not that clean that it takes years to write. In other words, let's talk about practical tips. And the first practical tip is to eliminate unnecessary comments. In the example provided, we see a piece of code that clearly suffers from over-commenting. All they do is just duplicate a code you wrote. Let's take the first comment as an example. And what happens in my head right now is that I read the comment, I look at the line of code, I go back to the comment, and I'm trying to figure out if there is something that I don't understand, is that the comment is trying to explain. So it's actually making it harder for me to understand the code. And now what I'm gonna do is delete the comment, and it instantly becomes much more easier for me when I look at this line of code. And I clearly understand that we get all the users whose contact IDs match the one we got over here. Not only it's easier to understand, but now I don't have any concerns that I've missed something. So in one word, code tells you how, comments tell you why. This and only this meaning should be in your comments. So let me remove all this garbage from the code, and now when I look at it, it doesn't look so scary anymore. That is, the comments were not helping, they were cluttering up your code. The next tip is called be careful with limit 1. And to better understand this, let's look at our code in this line and this if condition. What's wrong with it? The problem is that this if condition will never be executed, and by never I mean never, and not because our data is so accurate and we always find a contact, but because if the contact doesn't exist, we will get this exception. List has no rows for assignment to S object. The reason is that using this construction of a so-called query with limit 1 has a one significant nuance. When you use this limit 1 clause, you might want to assign the result to a single query right here and don't create a list. However, what is not obvious is that in the case where this query does not return any result, this line will throw you an exception because you tried to assign to a single contact here instead of using a list. That's how it works, we get what we get, but there is a way to avoid it. Whenever you need to retrieve one record, I recommend working with a list anyway. Here you have to specify a list of contacts instead of a single contact, leaving everything else as it is, and if this query does not return anything, this list will be empty but no exception will be thrown. And after that you can check whether the list is empty. If it is, assign null. If not, take the first value from the list. I also recommend moving such annoying paths into a separate method. Not that it's critical, but if you need to do such things several times in one method, it will look terrible and make a mess. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, right? And before I move on to the third tip, I highly recommend checking out this article about a return early button. It's not exactly about Salesforce, but it explains an interesting concept of how we can make your code work better. And actually the third tip is based on one of the elements from that article, namely the guard clause. We will stick to the same code as before, and as you may have noticed, after receiving the primary contact here, at the end we check whether the list of cases has more than 0 records. If so, then we start executing a certain job. Here the advice is more on a strategic level, namely what's the point of executing all this code in between if after receiving the cases right here at the top, we can check that if there is nothing to work with, stop the method execution and do not proceed right away. This will allow the method to run faster as we are not processing unnecessary code. And secondly, you will save all sort of sockholes for your transaction, which is always a good practice. And this is exactly what the guard clause says. That is some kind of conditions that determines whether it makes sense to continue execution or not, supported by such ideas that you should as soon as possible determine that moment when the execution of the code no longer makes sense, and either end execution or return an exception depending on your method. A similar example for this method would be checking at the very beginning whether our set contact IDs is empty, and if it is empty, why even try to execute any SQL queries? Just end execution of this method right away and call it a day. This is one of the most important strategies that you should always keep in mind when writing your code, and believe me, it will come in handy especially as the amount of code increases. And now we move on to the JavaScript with this dummy code. Here we determine whether the order is eligible for discount, and if so, we call one function, if not, another. What's wrong here? Well, first of all, here I see a lot of so-called magic numbers, right here, 120, 10, and so on. And if it looks normal to you at a time, ask your colleague to look at the code, or even better, come back to it in a month. I guarantee you will have no idea why these numbers are, what they mean, and how to manage them. So what we do is create constant variables at the top of your code, right here, where we write a name for each of these numbers, such as the minimum quantity, maximum price per item, and so on for all the numbers that we have. And I also create a constant for that string. After that, I just take and replace these incomprehensible numbers with a clear name, what they mean. In this way, also we waste an extra minute of our life. We save ourselves for a huge headache in the future. Also, while I'm here, one simple but effective rule is to format your code. Please. Right now it looks just awful, and yeah, we have a few lines of code and we can deal with that, but if your function has more lines, you're likely to have a heart attack. So just align the lines the way they should be. Line, aligned, there is some, you see, yeah? How does this look to you now? If the answer is okay, then I have something else to show you. Namely, let's deal with these conditions right here. They are all in one if statement now and it looks just terrible. And what if you need to add a few more conditions? This is probably one of the most painful topics for me. I wanna cry when I see such conditions. To protect yourself from this, go somewhere to the end of your code and create a function called isQualified for special discount. Here the important element is that if your function or method returns a boolean value that is true or false, always start it with is or to be. Is qualified. Now, what we do is take all the conditions from this terrible if statement and put them in a separate function. Then we simply replace all of this in our if condition with a method call. It looks better this way, doesn't it? This code is now not only more readable, but also more maintainable. These tips that we just considered for your JavaScript code can and should be applied to your Apex as well. These are general tips that are not limited to specific programming languages. And in that, I'd like to say that very often we misunderstand the clean code concept. First of all, remember that you define what this clean is, not any book. You read, you listen, you make decisions, and most importantly, you're consistent. Add a pinch of you're not gonna need it principle to the top, and believe me, the process of writing clean code will become very useful and fun for you. Anyway, we should always grow, shouldn't we?